ಇಂದ್ರ ಆಯ್ತು. Namaste, good evening, and once again a very warm welcome to all of you on the second day of the second edition of this series of lectures on Acharya Jadunath Sarkar, or the Ascetic Majesty of Indian history. So just to recap some highlights from yesterday's session, we did a quick rewind yesterday of what we saw in the first edition, followed by some anecdotes of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar's contributions to Indian history and historiography, his work and his scholarship, and how he became the pioneer for various initiatives that has sculpted and shaped Indian history for at least 60 years. And finally, we closed yesterday's session by looking at a great initiative that Acharya Jadunath Sarkar had seeded. This was the first ever seminar type of teaching Indian history at a place called Kamshet, which is near Pune. And this seminar took place in the home of his close friend, G.S. Sardesai. And, we also closed yesterday's session by quoting Dipesh Chakraborty, who's the author of a famous book on Jadunath Sarkar. And it was a very painful sight when he went there, visited Kamshet, Sardesai's house in Kamshet about 10 years back. It was completely dilapidated, fallen down. Nobody even remembered Sardesai's family or his name. And that, such a sacred place, there are plans afoot to convert it into a center for paragliding. So we closed yesterday's session on that rather sorry note. So, to begin today's session, we can look at, that was one of the great landmarks that Jadunath Sarkar had left behind. And we begin today's session by looking at two other landmarks that Acharya Jadunath Sarkar has given us. And the second landmark is in the field of Indian historiography, but strictly speaking, this has become a landmark in hindsight. That is, when we read those accounts today, we spot that it is indeed a landmark. But during the lifetime of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar, it was actually his ambition. And today I'll read out a couple of, facets of how he pursued that ambition. And sadly, even during his own lifetime, it remained an unrealized ambition, although Jadunath Sarkar had begun working towards it from a very, very young age. And I can't do justice, if I say it in my own words, it'll be hard to capture the entire essence of, what he did. So I will turn to Dr. Kwanungo. He was Jadunath Sarkar's disciple, as you all know. And he gives us a very vivid and highly moving and even a furious, very angry description of Jadunath Sarkar's ambition. And I quote, "Jadunath's ambition was to sit down in old age and edit and publish a corpus of original materials in different languages utilized by him in his constructive works on history. For 60 long years, he has been an indefatigable digger of original materials available in libraries and archives of India. Though he has not traveled abroad to visit famous libraries of Europe, he can legitimately claim that through the catalogues of these libraries, aided by a historian's instinct, he has been able to spot all the essential materials and secure those by transcripts, rotary bromide prints and photostats, as well as microfilm copies for his own use." So, ಕೆಲವುದು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಹೆಸರು ಮಾತ್ರ ಗೊತ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ, but to travel abroad, it takes a certain kind of formal training to do all this. But of course, he had a formal training, as a history scholar. But it is one thing to sit in India and talk about all this and collect that, but an entirely different thing to physically visit them. So when you regard his work, ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕಟಾಲ್ಲಿ, ಪಾಟ್ನಾದಲ್ಲಿ, ಡಾರ್ಜಿಲಿಂಗಲ್ಲಿ ಕೂತು ಇದನ್ನು ಮಾಡೋದಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ನಥಿಂಗ್ ಶಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೂಪರ್ ಹ್ಯೂಮನ್ ಎಫರ್ಟ್ ದಟ್ ಹಿ ಡಿಡ್. And Konungo says, Jadunath's project of a corpus will perhaps remain an unfulfilled ambition. Its huge expenditure is beyond private resources, beyond even the capacity of a provincial exchequer. Provincial exchequer ಅಂದರೆ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಕಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ತಗೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಟ್ರೆಜರಿ. ಇವ್ರು ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ಕಾರ್ಪಸ್ ಬಿಲ್ಡ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ವಿಷನ್ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂತಂದರೆ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಬಜೆಟ್ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಚೆಕರ್ ಅಷ್ಟು ಸಾಕಾಗ್ತಾ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಇರೋದು. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು ಅಂತ ಇವ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಕಾನುಂಗು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಫೈನಲಿ he says, he leaves this on a very somber note. He says, ಇಂಥದ್ದು ಒಂದು ಯುನೀಕ್ ಪ್ರಾಜೆಕ್ಟು ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಲೇಬೇಕು ಅಂತ he writes, and he also gives us the consequence, and I quote, "The only man who can do this work may not be available when our central government would awake to the necessity of having a corpus of Indo-Muslim history replacing the pioneering work started by Eliot and Dowson." Close quote. ಅಂದರೆ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಸೆಪರೇಟ್ ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಬಡ್ಜೆಟ್ ಅಲೊಕೇಶನ್ ಮಾಡೋವಂಥ ವಿಷನ್ ಇತ್ತು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ವಾಟ್ Konungo says is that this was the only man in India who not only had the vision but also the training and the methods and techniques to actually assemble this kind of corpus. It never happened. And I'll tell you why it never happened. He says, replacing the pioneering work started by Eliot and Dowson. So this needs to be contextualized slightly. So John Dowson and Eliot. So Eliot was a British bureaucrat, a very high-ranking ICS officer who lived and stayed in India for a long time. For the first time, he compiled 8 volumes, or I think 11 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. I think 8 maybe. So called The History of India as told by its own historians. So ಏನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅಂದರೆ, for the first time, all the Muslims who wrote Indian history, ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಇದ್ದವರು, ಅದಷ್ಟು ಮೆಟೀರಿಯಲ್, ದಿಸ್ ಬಿಗಿನ್ಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ವಾಟ್ ಹಿ ಕಾಲ್ಸ್ ಅರ್ಲಿ ಅರಬ್ ಜಿಯೋಗ್ರಫರ್ಸ್. ಮೊದಲು ಮೊಹಮ್ಮದ್ ಬಿನ್ ಕಾಸಿಮ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಬರೋಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಸಲ್ಮಾನ್ ಅರಬ್ ಮರ್ಚೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಕಮ್ ಹಿಯರ್ ಟು ಡೂ ದರ್ ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಲೈಕ್ ದಟ್. ದೇ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಗಿವ್ ಅಸ್ ಹಾರ್ಸಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದೇ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಟೇಕ್ ಸ್ಪೈಸಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅದರ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಹಿಯರ್. ಸೊ ಅರ್ಲಿ ಅವರೆಲ್ಲ ಬರೆದಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋಗಿದ್ದರು, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ದೇಶದ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇದೆ, ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ರೂಟ್ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ. ಆ ಕಾಲದಿಂದ ಹಿಡಿದು ಕೊನೆ ಟಿಲ್ ದ ಡೆತ್ ಆಫ್ ಔರಂಗಜೇಬ್, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತನಕ ಲಾಂಗ್ ಲೈನ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಸ್ಲಾಮಿಕ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟಾರಿಯನ್ಸ್, ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಲೆಫ್ಟ್ ಬಿಹೈಂಡ್ ಹ್ಯೂಜ್ ಕ್ರಾನಿಕಲ್ಸ್. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದೇ ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮ್, ಒಂದೇ ಕಡೆ ಸಿಗೋ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ 8 ವಾಲ್ಯೂಮಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಹೋಗಿದ್ದರು ಇಲಿಯಟ್ಟು. ಈ ವರ್ಕನ್ನು ವಿಲಿಯಂ ಡೌಸನ್ ಅಂತ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು, ಅವ್ರು ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಒಂದು ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಪರಿಷ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ಹೋಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದ ಪ್ರೈಮರಿ ಸೋರ್ಸ್ ಟು ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ದ ಆಕ್ಯುರೇಟ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಟೋಲ್ಡ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಇಸ್ಲಾಮಿಕ್ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್. ಅಂದರೆ ಮುಸಲ್ಮಾನರೇ ಬರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದರು, ಅವರೇ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ನಮ್ಮ ಸುಲ್ತಾನ ಎಷ್ಟು ಗ್ರೇಟು, ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಕಾಫಿರ್ಗಳನ್ನ ಕೊಲೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದ, ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ದೇವಸ್ಥಾನ ಧ್ವಂಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದ, ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಲಾರ್ಜ್ ಸ್ಕೇಲಲ್ಲಿ ಹಸುಗಳನ್ನ ಕುಯ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದ, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ಅ ಹ್ಯೂಜ್ ಪೀರಿಯಡ್, 1000 years ಆಲ್ಮೋಸ್ಟ್. ಇದನ್ನು ಕಂಪೈಲ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮು ಇಲಿಯಟ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಫಾಲೋಡ್ ಬೈ ಡೌಸನ್. ಇದನ್ನು ಸರ್ಪಾಸ್ ಮಾಡೋವಂಥ ಕೆಲಸ ಜದುನಾಥ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು. But it was unfinished. And like Konungo says, this, the only man who can do this may no longer be available. Andre, it was politely saying that he may no longer be alive. If at all the government wakes up to the importance of this project, and the central government after independence. The central government never awoke because it was headed by Nawab Nehru, and people who spoke blunt truth, people like Acharya Jadunath Sarkar, they were regarded as obstacles in Nehru's ugly project of, giving injection of something called secularism on the Indian people, brainwashing at least 2-3 generations. But anyway, that's a different story. And students, scholars and researchers who stayed in Jadunath Sarkar's home, it was a Gurukula like I mentioned, they have all left behind beautiful descriptions, very moving descriptions of how Jadunath worked towards this corpus. And I'll just give a summary. I can't read out the whole thing. So, when Jadunath Sarkar was even 60 years old, he worked with the energy and zeal of a youth who was, 25 or 26 years old at that age. So from early morning till midnight, Jadunath immersed himself in this tapasya towards building this corpus. And he took a break of maximum of say 3 or 4 hours. And what would he do in these 3-4 hours? He took his meals and he took his walking, which was like a penance for him. For example, after he had his lunch, Jadunath would walk around his bungalow as if he was lost in meditation. He was constantly thinking about his corpus and other works and constantly planning. So we have a person called Professor A.L. Srivastava. He was a direct disciple of Jadunath Sarkar, and he stayed in the Acharya's Gurukula in Darjeeling, and he has given us a very, very elevating profile of Jadunath Sarkar and his method of working. Quote, it's a small quote. His regularity, punctuality, hard labor, and devotion to scholarly pursuits at the age of 60 produced a profound effect upon me, and consciously or unconsciously, he became a living ideal for me. Close quote. ಇನ್ಯಾವ ಪಾಠ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಬುಕ್ಕಿಂದ ಹೇಳ್ತಿರೋ ಇಲ್ಲ ಲೆಕ್ಚರ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಿರೋ, ಇನ್ನೇನು ಗುರು ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡವನು ಇನ್ನೇನು ಹೇಳದೆ ಹೋದ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಡದೆ ಹೋದ್ರು ಇದಾಗಬೇಕು. He should become a living ideal. And this is what Jadunath Sarkar was. And now we can turn to the third and the final landmark that Jadunath Sarkar has carved for himself in the realm of Indian history and historiography. And this is like an overall assessment of Jadunath Sarkar as one of the greatest historians, if not the greatest historian that India has produced. Now, in his own lifetime, Jadunath Sarkar was compared to a wide variety of legendary historians throughout the world, and that included his comparison with one of the world's greatest historians. His name is Edward Gibbon. He is the author of the encyclopedic 5 volumes of The Decline and the Fall of the Roman Empire, spectacular work. So Jadunath was compared to Gibbon. And both Indian and European scholars have called Jadunath as the Bengali Gibbon, and they have compared this with deserved justification. But it must be remembered that Gibbon and others were not chained by the kind of shackles and constraints that Jadunath Sarkar was bound in. Freeಯಾಗಿ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಅವರೆಲ್ಲ. So even on the yardstick of being a polyglot, Jadunath Sarkar scores higher than Gibbon. He had mastered his mother tongue Bengali. He had mastered Sanskrit, Hindi, Marathi. This is ancient Marathi, not Halagannada antaralla, adu aa kalad Marathi, archaic Marathi. And he had also mastered foreign languages like English and Persian. And he was also fluent in French, Portuguese, German, Greek, and Latin. ಇದು ಗಿಬ್ಬನ್ಗೆ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತು ಆ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡರ್ಡಲ್ಲಿರೋ ರ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅದರ್ ಪೀಪಲ್, they all knew only European languages. And relatively speaking, Jadunath Sarkar's scope and span of historical research was much wider and much, much tougher than compared to Gibbon. And even more fundamentally, Acharya Jadunath Sarkar had also mastered European history, and he could write and speak on it with authority, and it is doubtful that Gibbon could do the same thing with Indian history. ನಮಗೆ ಹಿತ್ತಲ್ ಗಿಡ ಮದ್ದಲ್ಲ. So Dr. Kwanungo had all this in mind when he gave a beautiful and near perfect assessment of Jadunath Sarkar, and I quote, Jadunath's historical characters owe their brilliancy and vivacity as well as their photographic realism to his skill in presenting them with charming makeup, an art which no master can teach his pupil. ನಡೆಯೋದು ಹೇಗೆ ಅಂತ ಯಾರೂ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ, ನೀವೇ ನಡಿಬೇಕು. This is Jadunath Sarkar. Jadunath has no peer in his own field in India and abroad. He is preeminently a product of the Western school of history, though his subject is Indian. His charm of style and vigorous portraiture of men and things suggest a comparison with Macaulay, according to some admirers. Others hold him to be the Gibbon of Hindustan. But he is neither a Macaulay nor a Gibbon. This is very beautiful. These three are masters of narration, each in his own way. As an essayist, Macaulay wields the hatchet with the strength of a giant, whereas Jadunath handles the chisel and the needle of a thoughtful stonecutter. In producing effect, Jadunath could not approach Macaulay because this Indian lacks the impetuosity, vehemence, and bias of Macaulay in taking a rhetorical jump without calculating the risk of overstatement. Jadunath never wrote for sheer effect, but always for measured accuracy. Jadunath could not afford to be picturesque without being suspected and challenged at every step. If Jadunath is anything today, he is the stern prophet of free India in his writings and speeches. Close quote. Picturesque, and you should all read, just one line of his history. When he describes, for example, a battle, ಪೂರ್ತಿ ಡ್ರೆಸ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಬ್ಯಾಟಲ್ ಆಫ್ ತಾಲಿಕೋಟೆಯಲ್ಲಿದ್ದರೆ ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ಆರ್ಮಿ ಸೋಲ್ಜರ್ ಏನೇನು ವಸ್ತ್ರ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ರು, ಆ ಸುತ್ತಮುತ್ತಲು ಇರೋ ಸರೌಂಡಿಂಗ್ಸು, ಬೆಟ್ಟ, ನದಿ, ಗುಡ್ಡ, ಹೇಗೆ ಫಾರ್ಮೇಷನ್ ಇತ್ತು, ಕಾನ್ವರ್ಸೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಏನಿತ್ತು, ಇದನ್ನು ನಮಗೆ ಕಣ್ಣು ಮುಂದೆ ಇಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಥರ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಅದು ನೋಡೋಕ್ಕೆ, ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಡಿನರಿ. ಇದನ್ನು ಪ್ರೋಸಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೆಯೋದಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಗದ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೆಯೋದಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ದಿಸ್ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಬಿ ಡನ್ ಬೈ ಎ ಸೂಪರ್ ಮ್ಯಾನ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಇನ್ ಅ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ ಲೈಕ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ, ಹಿ ಈಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ರೈಟಿಂಗ್ ಫಿಕ್ಷನ್. ಕಥೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೂ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು, ಆದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಯುರೇಸಿನ ಚಾಲೆಂಜ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಕೆಂಪು ಕಿರೀಟ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದ ಇವನು ಯಾರೋ ರಾಮರಾಯ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಅದಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನಾಳೆ ಚಾಲೆಂಜ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಇವ್ರ ಮರ್ಯಾದೆ ಏನಾಗಬೇಕು ಅವಾಗ? ಸೊ ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವೈ ಹಿ ಇನ್ಸಿಸ್ಟೆಡ್ ಆನ್ ಪ್ರೈಮರಿ ಸೋರ್ಸಸ್ ವಿತ್ ಸಚ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಟ್ನೆಸ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅದರ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ ರೈಟ್ ಅಬೌಟ್ ಹೌ ಹಿ ವುಡ್ ಗೋ. ಈಗ ಬ್ಯಾಟಲ್ ಆಫ್ ತಾಲಿಕೋಟ ಇದೆ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್. ತಾಲಿಕೋಟೆಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದರು ಅವರು. He would read up on the Battle of Talikota, all the descriptions from the primary sources, and he would take a copy of that, go to Talikota physically. ನಡೆದಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ಇವರು ಹೇಳಿದ ಬೆಟ್ಟ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತ ಹುಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು, ಇವ್ರು ಹೇಳಿದ ತೊರೆ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತ ಹುಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಹಿ ವುಡ್ ಎನ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ಇಟ್. ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಎಗರಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ ಬರೆದಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. 20 ಅಡಿಯಿಂದ ಎಗರಿದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಯಾರೋ ಕುತ್ತಿಗೆ ಸೀಳಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಬ್ಯಾಟಲ್ ಇನ್ ಆಲ್ ದೀಸ್ ಪ್ರೈಮರಿ ಸೋರ್ಸಸ್. ಹಿ ವುಡ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ಕ್ಲೈಂಬ್ ಅಪ್ ದೇರ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಎಸ್ಟಿಮೇಟ್ that, can I really take my sword and jump down from 20 feet and cut the head of some guy ಅಂತ. ಇದನ್ನು ಫಿಸಿಕಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ಮಾಡಿ ನಂತರ ಬರಿತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಎನಿವೆ, ಸೊ ವಿ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ರೌಂಡ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿಸ್ ಸೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಬೈ ಸೈಟಿಂಗ್ an immortal verse from DVG's ಮಂಕುತಿಮ್ಮನ ಕಗ್ಗ. ನಿಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಹಲವರು ಗೊತ್ತಿರುತ್ತಿದೋ. ಅಕ್ಕಿಯೊಳಗನ್ನವನು ಮೊದಲಾರು ಕಂಡವನು, ಅಕ್ಕರದ ಬರಹಕ್ಕೆ ಮೊದಲಿಗನದಾರು, ಲೆಕ್ಕವಿರಿಸಿಲ್ಲ ಜಗತನ್ನಾದಿ ಬಂಧುಗಳ, ದಕ್ಕುವುದೇ ನಿನಗೆ ಜಸ ಮಂಕುತಿಮ್ಮ. There's a reason I quoted this in this context, because in the space of Jadunath Sarkar's pioneering legacy to Indian history, it was he who saw the anna in the akki. That is, he had found the exact method to separate the husk and the dirt that had surrounded the real kernel of Indian history. ಅದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಸೆಪ್ರೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ನಮಗೆ ಬಡಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ. Yet to our lasting misfortune, for the longest time, our own country, our own people, ಲೆಕ್ಕವಿರಿಸಿಲ್ಲ ಜಾದುನಾಥ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರ್ ಅವರನ್ನು. And now we can turn to the next section, and this is very, very important. In fact, it is one of the central areas, one of the key pillars of Acharya Jadunath Sarkar's professional life and his academic life as well. And in many ways, this area of Jadunath Sarkar's life was also one of the defining areas of his entire work of a lifetime. And this story begins on 11th March 1891. That date, the British government founded something called the Imperial Record Department in Calcutta. And from day one, its charter was to aggregate, collect, appraise, evaluate, and manage the documents of all the departments of the British government. And this institution was headed by a position called the Keeper of Records. And in 1911, this organization physically shifted from Calcutta to New Delhi, and that building still stands at the same place in Delhi at the junction of Rajpath and Janpath. And access to the Imperial Record Department was tightly controlled given the secretive colonial nature of the British government. And after independence, the Imperial Record Department was renamed as the National Archives of India. In 1919, the British government also established one more institution. This was called the Indian Historical Records Commission, or the IHRC, which I briefly mentioned yesterday. And we have no better authority than Acharya Jadunath Sarkar to narrate its brief history, because he was also one of the founding members. Quote, "The Indian Historical Records Commission was constituted by the Government of India in 1919 for the purpose of advising it on the best means of preserving its records, listing and calendaring them, making them accessible to the public, and publishing catalogues and reproductions of the more important papers in the state archives. The commission, at its inception, consisted only of 3 keepers of government records, with 3 historical scholars to give it expert advice. But it was at once found that the records of our country were in a very different condition from those in England and France, and therefore required a different treatment. In several provinces, the government had no properly organized record office and no special record officer, while others were remarkably advanced in this respect. At the same time, the government did not hold all the historical records, leaving out the ancient and medieval periods of our country's history. Many records of even the European period are in the possession of private persons and are needed to supplement and complete the contents of the state archives. In order to tempt private collections of records out of their hiding places, and not only to save them from ants, but also bring them to the notice of scholars, it was decided to visit the different provinces in rotation and invite the public to our meetings, at which historical papers would be read and discussed, and to organize an exhibition of historical documents and objects of interest or art. This development of our activity has been eminently successful." Close quote. Andre, all these very, very important, crucial papers, primary sources of our history, were clearly scattered across India. And Jadunath Sarkar, I told you the story of that indoor, record burning yesterday. So, ಈ ಥರ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಿಂದ ಇದನ್ನು ಸೇವ್ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಈ IHRC umbrella, under that umbrella called IHRC, all these documents, were attempted to be brought in. So, I have taken this portion from Jadunath Sarkar's address to the IHRC session in 1928. That is about 10 years since its inception. So when a man like Jadunath says that this development of our activity has been eminently successful, 10 ವರ್ಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಡೆಡಿಕೇಟೆಡ್ ಆಗಿ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಏನೇನೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು ಅಂತ. The classic example in our own state is Sir M. Visvesvaraya. In just 6 years, Mysore University ಬಂತು, KRS ಬಂತು, ಮೈಸೂರು ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಬಂತು, ಇಂಜಿನಿಯರಿಂಗ್ ಕಾಲೇಜಸ್ ಬಂತು, ಇಲ್ಲೇ ಜಯಚಾಮರಾಜೇಂದ್ರ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಪಾಲಿಟೆಕ್ನಿಕ್ಕು, ಅದು ಬಂತು. Just one man's vision translated into action, 6 years, what all has been done. So the same thing applies in the case of Sarkar as well. And but as an imperial body, the Indian Historical Records Commission, it followed a very strict hierarchy. The topmost positions were obviously occupied by British officials, and the rest were called non-official members, and they had varying tenures. And Jadunath Sarkar's tenure was 3 years. Minimum tenure is 3 years, after which it had to be renewed. And in his case, his tenure was renewed continuously from 1919 till 1940. So I'll just give you a brief picture of how the IHRC looked in 1919, that is its administrative structure. It had a grand total of just 8 members. 4 of them were ex officio, that means they belonged to the British government. The highest position was the president, and he was the secretary to the government of India of the education department. The second official was a keeper of records of the government of India, and he was the secretary of this body. The third position was the curator of the Madras Record Office and the keeper of records of the Bengal government. They were its members. And all these topmost 4 members were British. The remaining 4 non-official members included the following names: Professor Jadunath Sarkar, Archdeacon W.K. Firminger, Professor L.F. Rushbrook Williams, and Mr. B.K. Thakur. So, 8 ಜನದಲ್ಲಿ 6 ಜನ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷು, 2 ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್. The first session of the IHRC was held in Shimla in 1919, and Jadunath Sarkar took off like a rocket right from the start. His devotion and dedication to Indian history, it was the inexhaustible source of fuel supply that propelled this rocket journey. And I can only give you the briefest highlights of Jadunath Sarkar's all-encompassing, tireless and multifaceted contribution to the IHRC. First, in the very first session, Jadunath examined the voluminous manuscript of Colonel Todd. Now, Colonel Todd was a British army official. He has written a very beautiful work in 2 volumes. It's called Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. One of the very few sympathetic and works, which praise the Rajput dynasty. It's a very beautiful book. It's available. I think Rupa Publications has printed, available at a very low price. Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. So, Colonel Todd, he had collected all these, a bunch of manuscript. It was titled Origin, Progress and Present State of the Pindaris and the Outline Plan for Reducing the Pindaris. Todd, Jadunath Sarkar, when he looked at all these bunch of, manuscript of Todd, he concluded that all of this bunch of papers had little historical value, but nevertheless, they had to be printed for posterity's sake. ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ಡಿಸ್ಟ್ರಾಯ್ ಮಾಡಬಾರ್ದು ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಮ್ಯಾಗ್ನಾನಿಮಸ್ ವ್ಯೂ. Number 2, in the 1921 session, Jadunath recommended the survey of some very valuable Portuguese records at Goa, and the IHRC accepted this recommendation, and it entrusted this very, very tough task to an organization called the Bharata Itihas Samshodak Mandal, situated in Pune. But to give an idea of the kind of work that was involved, the Itihas Mandal had to do the following tasks. 1, to sort out and copy the valuable Marathi records. All these were handwritten. 2, to prepare an index to the Persian records. 3, to calendar the important Portuguese records. Idella prana hoguanta kelsa. All these had to be done manually. Chronology, dating is very, very important. Usually all these documents, they would be bundled either in, they would be put either in gunny bags or sacks or canvas or, other binding, and literally ಕುಂಬರ್ಸ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು ಇದನ್ನು. ಒಂದೊಂದಾಗೆ ಡೇಟನ್ನ ಅರೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ ವೈಸ್ ಅರೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಯಾವ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ಬರೆದ್ರು ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಇಂಡೆಕ್ಸು ಕ್ರಾನಾಲಜಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಪ್ರಾಣ ಹೋಗೋ ಕೆಲಸ ಇದನ್ನು. So this was the scope of the work, sheer donkey labor. And Jadunath Sarkar's proposal was so compelling that the IHRC immediately sanctioned a grant of 600 rupees to the Itihas Samshodak Mandal. 600 rupees in 1921. 100 ವರ್ಷದ ಮುಂಚೆ. Number 3, I just quoted Jadunath Sarkar's address at the 1928 session, when he said that, I'm happy that this work is progressing at a very good pace. And this 1928 session was held in Nagpur, and Jadunath Sarkar was the first history scholar in India to draw attention to the need for salvaging, rescuing and preserving records and historical manuscripts lying in private collections. ಅಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ತೋಚೆ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಯಾರಿಗೂ. ಅಂದರೆ ಟುಡೇ ವೆನ್ ಯು ಲುಕ್ ಎಟ್ ಆಲ್ ದಿಸ್, ವಿ ಆರ್ ಲಿವಿಂಗ್ ಇನ್ ಅನ್ ಏಜ್ ಆಫ್ ಲಕ್ಸುರಿ. ವಿ ಟೇಕ್ ಸೋ ಮೆನಿ ಥಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ಗ್ರಾಂಟೆಡ್. ಸಮಥಿಂಗ್ ಆ್ಯಸ್ ಸಿಂಪಲ್ ಆಸ್ ದಿಸ್ ಯಾರಿಗೂ ತೋಚಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಇದನ್ನು ತಂದು ಒಂದು ಕಡೆ ಇಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. Number 4, in the 1929 session of the IHRC, Jadunath Sarkar outdid himself, his all past performances. This session was held in Gwalior, and here he came up with one more new recommendation. And this recommendation was to open up the huge treasure trove of historical documents of something called the Peshwa Daftar, which is in Pune, to genuine public scholars. ಈ ಪೇಶ್ವಾ ದಫ್ತರ್ ಅಂದರೆ ನಮಗೆ, ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವೇರ್ ವಿ, ದಫ್ತರ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಆಫೀಸ್ ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಅ ಪ್ಲೇಸ್ ವೇರ್ ರೆಕಾರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ಸ್ಟೋರ್ಡ್. ಸೊ ದಿಸ್ ಪೇಶ್ವಾ ದಫ್ತರ್, ಇಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ literally thousands, if not 10,000s of correspondence and letters and, court orders, this kind of thing. And it gives us the first-hand evidence to reconstruct the history of the Maratha Empire, including all the way back to Shivaji. So, Jadunath said that, this Peshwa Daftar has to be thrown open, not only just for history scholars, not only just for academic scholars, but to all genuine public scholars who are interested in this area. And it did not matter, in Jadunath's view, it did not matter whether these scholars were affiliated with any university or institution. And here, this is extremely important, here the Acharya's vision shines with the resplendence of 1,000 suns. And the ultimate, the proof is in the pudding antaralla. So the ultimate outcome of the vision is known, by the results that it produces. So in this case, the outcome of this recommendation was the publication of something called the Pune Residency Correspondence Series in 14 volumes. So at this juncture, a self-taught scholar, his name is Govind Sakharam Sardesai, the same G.S. Sardesai. He had just retired from his official service in Baroda state, and he has settled in Kamshit. So he emerged from there and collaborated with Jadunath Sarkar on this extraordinary project. And that was also the, birth and the flowering of their lifelong friendship. And it was Jadunath Sarkar's encouragement that also led Sardesai to work on the monumental project named Peshwa Daftar. It was eventually published in 45 volumes, running into 7,800 pages. And for this, Sardesai had examined 35,000 primary documents in Marathi, some 10,000 primary documents in Persian, and other languages. I forget Marathi also, and some other languages. And thanks to this Peshwa Daftar, Sardesai was honored in Maharashtra with the nickname of Riyasatkar, meaning the compiler of historical records. In his time, he was a household name in Maharashtra. Today, I don't know who's a household name in that state. Anyway. And item number 5. In the 1930 session of the IHRC, Jadunath Sarkar gave another address, and he came out with one more recommendation. Now, the princely states or the native states, ನಮ್ಮ ರಾಜರು ಮಹಾರಾಜರು ಅಂತ ಯಾರ್ಯಾರು ಅಂತಾರಲ್ಲ ಅವರು ಪಾಳೆಗಾರರು, he recognized that they were perhaps the richest repositories of historical source documents. And in that session, he made an open and earnest appeal to the heads of all these princely states to allow access to research scholars to their source documents, and there was a profound reason behind Jadunath Sarkar's appeal. And as I narrated yesterday, Jadunath had learned an unforgettable lesson from the bitter experience that D.B. Parasnes had undergone at the hands of the Indore Darbar. Benkina idada. Sadly, his appeal fell on deaf ears, but the unfatigued Acharya repeated the same appeal again in 1937 in another session of the IHRC, but this time some princely states offered a positive response, but their number was less than 10. Less than 10 out of a total of 562 princely states. And finally, in his 1939 address at the IHRC session, Jadunath Sarkar gave an invaluable gift to serious history researchers and scholars in India. In that session, he appealed to the British government to relax its rules for permitting access to historical archives. Obviously, all kinds of dirt would be inside those archives. It was a colonial government anyway, so it had tightly shut its doors to Indian researchers, and Jadunath kept on appealing. And in the session of that year, Jadunath's passion, his sincerity, and the heartfelt nature of his appeal finally worked. And the next year, that is in 1940, the colonial British government finally permitted Indian scholars to consult all the non-current, that is non-contemporary, and all non-confidential records up to 1880. ಆ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದವರಿಗೆ ಇದರ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. This was the first time that Indian scholars were permitted to see the records of the British government even up to 1880. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ 1857 ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಇವರು ಮಾಡಿರೋವಂಥದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬ್ಲ್ಯಾಕ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ವೈಟಲ್ಲಿ ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟೆಡ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಪ್ರಿಸರ್ವ್ಡ್ ಇಟ್. ಇಫ್ ದೇರ್ ಇಸ್ ಎನಿಥಿಂಗ್ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ ವಿ ಶುಡ್ ಅಡ್ಮೈರ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ನೇಷನ್, ದ ಇಂಗ್ಲೆಂಡ್, ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ವರ್ಡನ್ನು ಲೆಟರ್ನು ಕೇರ್ಫುಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಆರ್ಕೈವ್ ಮಾಡೋ ಒಂದು ಸಂಪ್ರದಾಯ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಇದೆ. So, I mean, it goes, there are very hilarious accounts. The Prime Minister coughed in the midst of a 2-hour speech, and he coughed at, 25th minute in the speech. ಈ ಲೆಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಪ್ರತಿ ಒಂದು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. You should read their these are all documented in prose. ಇವಾಗೆಲ್ಲ ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ ಇದೆ, ಮೊಬೈಲ್ ಇವೆಲ್ಲ ಇದೆ. ಅವಾಗ ಏನಿತ್ತು? They were documented by hand. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಹ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ರಿಟನ್. Anyway, now at this stage, we need to pause and recall a very important point. While Jadunath Sarkar was engaged in this hectic work at the Indian Historical Records Commission, he was also simultaneously engaged in a variety of other tasks. For example, giving lectures at multiple universities in India, looking after some administrative work, maintaining his large family, looking after his personal expenditure and accounts. He would write all this. Plus, he was doing back-breaking research, and in this period, he was working on the third or fourth volume of the 4-volume series of later Mughals. And he was studying, researching, writing, and mentoring students and conducting seminars, not to mention taking off on extremely difficult tours to many historical places. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಈ IHRC ಕೆಲಸನೂ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಈ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲವು ಶಬ್ದಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ಭಾಳ ಅಗ್ಗ ಆಗೋಗಿದೆ. ದೈತ್ಯ ಪ್ರತಿಭೆ, ರಾಕ್ಷಸ ಪರಿಶ್ರಮ, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಯಾರ್ಯಾರಿಗೋ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಈ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ. ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟರ್ಗಳಿಗೆ, ಇವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಇದನ್ನು. ಬಟ್ ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ರೀಡ್ ಹಿಸ್ ಪ್ರೊಫೌಂಡ್ ಲೈಫ್. ಇಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಇದರ ನಿಜವಾದ ಅರ್ಥ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ ನಮಗೆ. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಇದು ಜದುನಾಥ್ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಸ್ವಯಂ ಬಾಳಿ ತೋರಿಸಿದಂತಹ ನಿದರ್ಶನ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಷ್ಟು ಅರ್ಥಪೂರ್ಣ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಈ ಮಾತುಗಳು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಐ ಸಿನ್ಸಿಯರ್ಲಿ ಅಪೀಲ್ ಟು ಆಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಯು to read all the speeches that Jadunath Sarkar had delivered to the IHRC. It is available online. All the speeches from 1919 all the way up to 1940. 21 varsha. They are all available online. And these are not just presidential addresses. He also presented his own research papers. And when you read that, it becomes very clear that this is an independent and a complete education in its own right. And one of his most devoted students, his name is Professor Hariram Gupta, he describes it in these words, and I quote, this is beautiful. As the senior most member of the Indian Historical Records Commission, Jadunath visited almost all the capital towns of British India as well as Indian states. On reaching his destination, he would immediately throw himself into the work he had to do without wasting a moment on superfluities. For over 20 years, he was the heart and soul of the IHRC from its very birth. A large number of historical papers are submitted every year at the session of this commission, and thus, during these years, Jadunath examined about 500 papers submitted to the commission by young and aspiring scholars from all over India. Close quote. I don't know how many hours he had in his day. And here's one more beautiful tidbit from G.S. Sardesai. And he talks about the Acharya's contribution to the IHRC. Quote, I can never forget the sessions of the Indian Historical Records Commission and seeing many a scene of history before my own eyes. Some of the places we thus visited included Indore, Ujjain, Mandsaur, Kota, Gwalior, Bhilsa, Sanchi, Dhulia, Ajanta, Ellora, Assai, Aurangabad, Daulatabad, Dulegaon, Raja, Sindkhed, Lonar, Mehkar, Basain, Karanja, Ramtek, Vijayanagar, Talikota, Gadag, Tanjavur, Sangameshwar, Mathura, Agra, Delhi, 29. I've stopped the list at 29. So, and one more anecdote, this comes from Dr. Kwanungo. He's written it with great love. Quote, a survey of Jadunath's zeal will remain incomplete without a notice of his work as the President of the Indian Historical Records Commission for many years since its inception. Its annual session became an institution of pilgrimage for scholars of medieval and modern periods of Indian history. It was hailed as an annual stock exchange of the progress of research and discovery of historical material. Jadunath was the main attraction of the session. Close quote. I can keep on quoting, but we have time constraints here. But I think these three anecdotes are sufficient to give us a clear idea of what kind of a man Jadunath Sarkar would have been. And his overall gift, his bequest, his inheritance to the IHRC, which was once a highly distinguished institution, it can only be compared to motherly love and nourishment. Bottle hal alla, yede hale hal. There's no other, analogy that I can give. But like the ungrateful child that kicks out his own mother after growing up, the IHRC insulted and humiliated Acharya Jadunath Sarkar and threw him out from the very institution that he had founded and nourished. It was the proverbial unkindest cut. It was worse than what Brutus did to Caesar. And this story is extremely painful, but it has to be told. ನಮಗೆ ಮರವು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಒಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಕಾಯಿಲೆ ಆಗೋಗಿದೆ. Deepesh Chakrabarti, he dedicates an entire chapter that narrates this tragic story in full. And it is fittingly titled, Archiving the Nation, Sarkar's Fall from Grace. And I will just give a summary of this horrible story. Acharya Jadunath Sarkar delivered his last presidential address to the Indian Historical Records Commission in 1940. But the sad fact, or the sadder fact, is that Jadunath himself didn't know that that would be his final address. And I will, quote some excerpts from various sources to give a backdrop of, this excerpt is from Jadunath Sarkar's address himself, his last lecture to the IHRC. Quote, the Indian Historical Records Commission has now completed 21 years of its existence, and it has expanded and developed on new lines in the course of its evolution. Its members have become practiced in the art of hunting for and utilizing the records with success. They have made solid contributions to the history of India. Above all, the holding of our annual sessions in different provinces and states has brought together scholars and archivists from all parts of our vast country and made them a band of brothers united in search of truth about India's past life and ready to help each other by the exchange of their individual knowledge and local experience, pooling their resources together at the shrine of the historic muse. So from his address, it is clear that all these sessions at the IHRC conducted in various cities, idu nijವಾದ ಅರ್ಥದಲ್ಲಿ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಇಂಟಿಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಇನ್ನೇನು. National integration done by the brightest minds, the most educated class of India. Now, after he finished his speech, Jadunath could have been unsuspecting, or he could have been overconfident, or both, when he uttered these heartfelt words that, this organization, we are all a band of brothers in a very sacred quest. But not all the brothers in that band had the guts or the magnanimity or the largeness of heart to stomach Jadunath's acerbic telling of truth. He could be very blunt, but he was not vicious. ಮನಸ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಕಲ್ಮಶ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ತಪ್ಪೇ. ದ ಸನ್ ರೈಸಸ್ ಇನ್ ದ ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಅಂದರೆ ತಪ್ಪು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದರೆ ನೀನು ನನ್ನ ಶತ್ರು ಅಂದರೆ ನಾನೇನು ಮಾಡಲಿ? So this has a backstory. For the past 12 or 15 years, Jadunath Sarkar and Sardesai, they had an ongoing clash or disputes with what they called the Pune historians or the Pune school. And foremost among these Pune historians was a man called Datto Vaman Pothdar or D.V. Pothdar. And he was also one of the founders of the Itihas Samshodak Mandal. Remember this organization's name? Jadunath had recommended and the government had granted 600 rupees. So Pothdar was one of the founders, and he was also a president much later of this Itihas Samshodak Mandal. And the clashes with these Pune historians, they were basically related to the subject of history, and it spanned a very wide range of topics. And very early in those days, late 20s onwards basically, they resented Jadunath Sarkar's depiction of Maratha history. Now, ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಅಂದರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಹಿಂದೂ ಇತಿಹಾಸ ಎಲ್ಲ ಏನು ಗ್ಲೋರಿಯಸ್ ಆಗಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಥರದ ಜನಗಳು ಇದ್ದರು, even in the Peshwa kingdom, even in the family of Shivaji. Their own records reveal, all these things. And Jadunath Sarkar merely told that, spoke this truth and wrote this truth. So this so-called Pune school, they condemned him as an outsider who had rudely interfered in their domain. ಅವ್ರ ಪ್ರಕಾರ ಇವನು ಬೆಂಗಾಲಿ ಫಾರಿನರ್ ಅನ್ನೋ ಲೆಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಬರಿತಾ ಇದ್ರು. And some members in that mandal also resented, they were jealous of the eminence and authority that Jadunath commanded in the IHRC, and they began issuing public condemnations when Jadunath Sarkar accepted the knighthood from the British. Knighthood andre sir title. They also questioned Jadunath Sarkar's approach to original materials or archives, and I will read out a small tidbit from Deepesh Chakrabarti. Quote, for Jadunath, archives were mainly of interest as a collection of original documents that ought to form the basis for scientific history. he used the platform of the IHRC to propagate this message. It is the status of these documents as original that interested him in the first place. Sarkar dreamed of a public records law that might nationalize and gather all records relating to the state, meaning both at the regional and central levels, into a single official structure. For historians such as Pothdar, archives were more about issues having to do with the access to documents. Close quote. ಎಲ್ಲಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ ತಾಳಮೇಲ ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ಒಬ್ಬರಿಗೆ ದೇ ವಾಂಟೆಡ್, I'll make it clearer as we go along. So in other words, what this means is that Jadunath wanted every genuine researcher and scholar and student from the general public to have access to India's historical archives. On the other hand, people like Pothdar wanted to treat the archives as private property or private fiefdoms. ನಾವು ಹೇಳಿದವ್ರಿಗೆ ಬೀಗ ತೆಗೆಬೇಕು ಈ ಥರ. And to quote Deepesh Chakraborty again, the victory of people like Pothdar ensured that the political control of access to documents at provincial levels remained firmly in the hands of the powerful historians of the provinces. Close quote. But to put this in plain language, people like Pothdar wanted political control of the IHRC. It had much less to do with history as a sacred calling or as an academic discipline, but more to do with establishing one's political power. Yellinda bantu. Yellig bantu. And this obviously was a clear violation of every principle and value and ideal that Jadunath Sarkar had held close to his heart. To just give you one example, Sardesai wrote a letter to Jadunath Sarkar suggesting that the venue for the 1938 meeting of the IHRC, he recommended that this venue should be shifted from Pune to Bombay. And Jadunath immediately replied with some anger, and I quote, just one line, "Why do you hanker for state dinners and lunches? Bombay is a city of money and power. Anta kade ಇಂಥ ಅಕಾಡೆಮಿಕ್ ಕಾನ್ಫರೆನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಯು ವಿಲ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ಇನ್ವೈಟ್ ಆಲ್ ಕೈಂಡ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಡಿಗ್ನಿಟರೀಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ನೋ ಮೀನಿಂಗ್ಫುಲ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ವಿಲ್ ಗೆಟ್ ಡನ್." ಇದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ನಿನ್ನೆ ಹೇಳಿದ್ನಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಕಾಮ್ಶೆಟ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಮಿನಾರ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಅಂತ. ಅನ್ಫಾರ್ಚುನೇಟ್ಲಿ ದಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್ ಸೆಮಿನಾರ್ ಆಫ್ ದಟ್ ಕೈಂಡ್. Now let's come back to 1940 once more. That year, there was another scholar named Surendranath Sen. He had written a very flattering history of the Maratha Empire. And in that year, Surendranath Sen was the keeper of record of the IHRC, official designation keeper of the record, but post title togondre, he was the secretary to the IHRC. And in terms of power structure, Surendranath Sen was higher than Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. And Surendranath Sen intended to make full use of that power. And Surendranath Sen was also a very close ally of D.V. Pothdar. And so, Jadunath Sarkar was isolated within the IHRC and faced an extremely hostile, petty and ruthless squad comprising Pothdar, Surendranath Sen and another guy called Shafat Ahmad Khan and almost the entire group of the Pune Itihas Samshodak Mandal. One man. And in fact, Sardesai had warned Jadunath Sarkar about their basic nature, of this Mandal's nature, as early as 1927, and I quote from his letter. It is an extremely hostile attitude of these Pune people which has retarded the progress of history in the university and with the government. They are extremely jealous of other workers and would rather damage all other work in the hope of pushing their own hobbies. Idu Sardesai assessment about these so-called Itihasic Mandal. And sure enough, the fatal damage occurred in 1940. And with Surendranath Sen now calling all the shots at IHRC, he lost no time in flexing his muscles. Additionally, his powerful position also enabled him to co-opt members to the IHRC and its various meetings. ಇಂಥ ದೊಡ್ಡ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಕಮಿಟಿ, ಗವರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಕಮಿಟಿ, ಕಮಿಷನ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲವು ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ಗಳು ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಅವಾಗವಾಗ. And some people would be invited to specific meetings and some people would be kept out for various reasons. So obviously this kind of power, allows you to do a lot of things. And I'll quote Dipesh Chakrabarty again. Sen thus put himself in a position to be the benefactor of numerous historians aspiring for recognition in the government circles. Close quote. ಇವತ್ತು ಇದು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ಸರ್ ಥರ ಹರಡಿದೆ. ಸರ್ ಅಕಾಡೆಮಿ ನಾಮಿನೇಷನ್ ಕೊಡಿ ಸರ್, ಸರ್ ಅವಾರ್ಡ್ಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಶನ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಸರ್, ಯಾವುದೋ ಕಮಿಟಿಗೆ ಚೇರ್ಮನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಸರ್. ಸೊ ದಿಸ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ breached all bounds of shamelessness today, but its earliest signs and symptoms are, visible in such institutions. And back to our story, one of the first things that Surendranath Sen did was to initiate a thorough reorganization of the IHRC. For one full year, he worked silently in the background and he began scheming with Pothdar and that group, and began making sweeping changes in secret. And what he was basically doing was he was preparing the ground for the final blow. But on the outside, in various meetings and seminars and things like that, Sen was extremely courteous to Jadunath Sarkar. He invited him to write a paper for the next session of the IHRC, and a straightforward man, an unsuspecting, plain-speaking, blunt man like Jadunath Sarkar did not suspect anything at all. He did not even have an idea what was all going on behind his back for one full year. And finally, Surendranath Sen landed his axe on Acharya Jadunath Sarkar in the December 1940 meeting of the IHRC. And he did it in an extremely dirty fashion. What he did was that he got D.V. Pothdar to present a last-minute proposal at that meeting. ಈಗ ಯೂಶಲಿ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ಗೆ ಅಜೆಂಡಾ ಮತ್ತು ಟಾಪಿಕ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಾರೆ, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದಟ್ ವುಡ್ ಬಿ ಸರ್ಕ್ಯುಲೇಟೆಡ್ ಟು ಆಲ್ ದ ಮೆಂಬರ್ಸ್ ವೆಲ್ ಇನ್ ಅಡ್ವಾನ್ಸ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಎನಿ ಐಟಮ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಅಜೆಂಡಾ ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ದೇರ್ will not be admitted in the last minute. This is procedure. Any organization works like that. So what this guy did, this Surendranath Sen did, was that he got Pothdar to present a last minute proposal which was not included in the agenda. And Jadunath Sarkar obviously stuck to the rule and he disallowed it. He said, I can't permit, this proposal or this agenda item. And on a simple ground, he said that, look, you have not circulated this item to all the members till now. You can't introduce it, at the last minute. And obviously, Sarkar's objection was entirely consonant with the rules and procedures. But what Jadunath had underestimated was that he had fatally underestimated Surendranath Sen and Pothdar's craftiness and cunningness. And therefore, he had neatly walked into the trap that they had set for him. And Dipesh Chakrabarty, he describes this, and I quote, "It would have been obvious to anyone watching Jadunath Sarkar's style that Sarkar depended on his prestige and status as a scholar, and his style was more direct and confrontational than wily and tactful. Thus, Sarkar's decision to disallow Pothdar's motion on a simple procedural ground made him look authoritarian." Close quote. So, ille power politics agate. So far, Jadunath Sarkar's tenure, the renewal of his tenure was simply a matter of, formality. Application hakond enilla. Colossus, he was a giant. Nobody would even dream of asking him a question that, sir, ನೀವು ಮತ್ತೆ ಸಬ್ಮಿಟ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೋ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ, ಆಟೋಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ರಿನ್ಯೂ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಇಂಥವ್ರು ಬಂದು ಕೂತ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ಸೊ ವಾಟ್ ದೇ ಡಿಡ್ ವಾಸ್ they recast Jadunath Sarkar's, they reduce Jadunath Sarkar's eminence by making him look like a villain. And immediately after, this story does not end here, okay? Immediately after the meeting, Pothdar wrote an official written complaint against Jadunath Sarkar to a man called Girija Shankar Bajpayee, the ex officio president of the IHRC. This fellow, Girija Shankar Bajpayee, became some kind of a minister much later. He was a chamcha of Nawab Nehru. That's a different story. And Pothdar, in his complaint, accused Jadunath Sarkar of dereliction of duty, unjust treatment, and finally he claimed, and I quote Pothdar's words, quote, Jadunath was guilty of unconstitutional procedures. And as planned, this was, working like a charm. It was working like magic according to the script that these buggers had written. Sorry for the language, but as planned, Surendranath Sen neatly endorsed Pothdar's complaint to Girija Shankar Bajpayee. And it worked like magic, like I said. The IHRC was reconstituted in 1942. And all the earlier members in that body were still retained in the new arrangement. All the earlier members except Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. But the story doesn't still end there. What was even worse was the manner in which Jadunath Sarkar was thrown out of IHRC. He received no formal or informal notice that the IHRC was being reconstituted. In fact, he received no correspondence at all. It was all done in a highly cold-blooded fashion intended to deliberately humiliate this colossus, to insult this giant who had birthed and nourished and nurtured this institution to its present height. And it really breaks our heart to read Jadunath Sarkar's letter to Sardesai even as late as August 6th, 1941. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಮಸಲತ್ ನಡೀತಾ ಇರುವಾಗ ಪಾಪ ಈ ಪುಣ್ಯಾತ್ಮರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಏನೇನು ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ. 1941 ಆಗಸ್ಟಲ್ಲಿ, ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಹಿ ರೈಟ್ಸ್, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಡಿಸೆಂಬರ್, ಟಿಪಿಕಲಿ ದ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದ IHRC ಆ್ಯನ್ಯುವಲ್ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ವುಡ್ ಬಿ ಹೆಲ್ಡ್ ಇನ್ ಡಿಸೆಂಬರ್ ಎವ್ರಿ ಇಯರ್. ಸೊ ಆ ವರ್ಷ 1941 ಡಿಸೆಂಬರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈಸೂರಲ್ಲಿ, ನಮ್ಮ ಮೈಸೂರಲ್ಲೇ ಆ ಸೆಷನ್ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಆ್ಯನ್ಯುವಲ್ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್. ದಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಅ ವೆನ್ಯೂ. ಸೊ ಹಿ ರೈಟ್ಸ್ ಎ ಲೆಟರ್ ಟು ಸರ್ದೇಸಾಯಿ and he says, we can meet December next year or so. We can meet in December so that, and I quote, we both could meet there if your health permits, or I shall visit you in Bombay on my way back. Clearly, Jadunath Sarkar had no idea that he had already been banished by 1941. And you know how he learned the news of his that he was thrown out of IHRC? He learned it from newspaper reports. And after that, he never set foot in the IHRC again. He never attended any of its meeting after 1942. The hyenas and the foxes and the jackals had finally surrounded and killed the lion. And Indian history and Indian historiography has paid the ultimate price. And after India attained questionable independence, the Imperial Record Department was renamed as National Archives. This happened in 1948. And the Indian Historical Records Commission was merged into this body, and Surendranath Sen and D.V. Pothdar and their group acquired a near monopoly over it. They called themselves nationalist historians, but as Deepesh Chakraborty says, and I quote him, they pursued a politics of ensuring greater access to official documents. Close quote. ನಮಗೆ ಈ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಆಕ್ಸೆಸ್ ಇದೆ, ನಿಮಗೆ ಆಕ್ಸೆಸ್ ಬೇಕಾ, ನಾವು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಮಾಡಿ. ದಿಸ್ ವಾಸ್ ಅ ಕಲ್ಚರ್ ದಟ್ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ಸೆಟ್ ಇನ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಪ್ಯಾರಲಲ್ ಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ಭೈರಪ್ಪನವ್ರದ್ದು ಅನ್ವೇಷಣೆ ಕಾದಂಬರಿ ನೋಡಿ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಕೇಂದ್ರ ಪಾತ್ರ ವಿಶ್ವನಾಥ್ ಅಂತ, ಅವನಿಗೆ ಪೊಲೀಸ್ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಎನ್ಕೌಂಟರ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆವಾಗ ಹೇಗಿದೆ ಅಂತ ನೋಡಿ, ಈ ಪ್ಯಾರಲ್ ಆವಾಗಲೇ ಇತ್ತು. ಎನಿವೆ, ದಿಸ್ ಕರಪ್ಷನ್ ಎಟ್ ಸೆಟ್ ಇನ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ದೆನ್, ಅದ್ರ ಬೇಡ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ Jadunath Sarkar himself provides an example of the kind of nationalist history that was being written back then in the 40s and early 50s, and I quote, "A comic example has been supplied by a Bengali graduate whose doctoral thesis has come under my eyes, and this graduate proves that there was a Red Cross society in ancient India because the Hindu kings went to battle followed by cooks, physicians and coolies who used to take care of their wounded." Close quote. ಇದು ಭಗವದ್ಗೀತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಟ್ರಿಂಗ್ ಥಿಯರಿ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ಕೆಲವರು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಆ ಸಾಲಕ್ಕೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಇದು. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ವಿ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಫೈನಲಿ ಆ್ಯಡ್ ಅ ಪೋಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಟ್ ಟು ದಿಸ್ ಟ್ರಾಜಿಕ್ ಸ್ಟೋರಿ. Way back in the 1930s, Jadunath Sarkar had indirectly predicted, or rather tangentially predicted, this outcome when he wrote a letter to Sardesai, and I quote, "The Pune School of Historical Students whose mutual wrangling andre fights have almost sterilized their intellects, and some of them have degraded their past history into an instrument of present-day political agitation." Close quote. Little did Jadunath Sarkar realize that one day he himself would be a victim of such closed minds. Which reminds me of a timeless proverb: never underestimate the power of idiots in large numbers. They can prove fatal. And in fact, Jadunath Sarkar must be among the handful of Indian historians to be banished and hated both by the leftists and the so-called nationalist historians of that era. And the Indian Historical Records Commission, or IHRC, it still exists today, and it meets every year as before. But today its main function is to train archivists. The life and soul went out of it after it insulted, humiliated, shunned and threw out Acharya Jadunath Sarkar. And to its eternal shame, the official history of the IHRC, you can look at its website, it does not mention Jadunath Sarkar's foundational role, nor his lifelong contribution to it. And now we can move on to the next section. After such a depressing tale, we look at some more interesting and useful and enlightening aspects of Jadunath Sarkar's life, which is his method of working and several other little known details. So I'll begin with a very, very delightful story of how Acharya Jadunath Sarkar built his fabulous personal library. Thankfully for us, and we don't need to, search hard for this to get this story, he has narrated this story in his own words in the January 1958 issue of Modern Review Journal, and he wrote this just 4 months before his death. During British colonial rule, most of the high-ranking and middle-ranking British officials and bureaucrats and administrators, they brought their entire libraries with them to India on ships. Normally in those days, flight irlilla. So a journey, a sea voyage would take a minimum of 1 month or 45 days. So Avaga Macaulay, for example, when he came to India from England, he read the entire set of Greek classics in just 1 month during that journey. And when these people left, when these British officials left, they sold all their Indian possessions. Don't hogakagalla. Illi iddira chairu, furniture, decorations, so obviously, and their book collections. So they sold all this to libraries and other wealthy people who could afford this book collections. And now we get to the story. Jadunath Sarkar, and I quote him, he says that my father used to buy the books of the retiring magistrates and judges, close quote. And his father's passion for books and knowledge naturally infected his illustrious son. Jadunath's early interest was limited to collecting military books because he was seeking an answer to a very basic question, and I quote him: "How did it happen that a few could defeat myriads who were not cowards or weaklings when both sides fought with firearms?" Close question. So, close quote. So, ಈ ಕ್ವೆಶ್ಚನ್ ಇಂದ ಏನು ತಿಳಿಯುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಆಫನ್ ಸೆಡ್ ದಟ್ ಮುಸ್ಲಿಂ ಇನ್ವೇಡರ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಸುಲ್ತಾನ್ಸ್ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಅ ವೆರಿ ಈಸಿ ಟೈಮ್ ಟು ಕಾನ್ಕರ್ ಹಿಂದೂ ಕಿಂಗ್ಸ್. ನಾಟ್ ಎಟ್ ಆಲ್. Both sides were evenly matched. Different reasons, we have to look at these battles individually to know the reason why they lost. So anyway, military history of various nations became Jadunath Sarkar's abiding passion, and it finally led him to write the splendid work titled A Military History of India, and he wrote this book when he was 87 years old. Superb volume ಅದು. And as Jadunath grew up and evolved into a budding scholar, his interests obviously widened and deepened, and they stayed with him till the end of his life. And now we get to the main part of the story, and I quote him: "From that time, it became my passion to buy rare books on Indian history. At first, those books written in English and relating to the British period only. My educational expenses were paid by my father, and I was free to spend all my own money from the first grade scholarships which I enjoyed throughout my college life on these India books." ಪಾಕೆಟ್ ಮನಿ, ಸ್ಕಾಲರ್ಶಿಪ್ ದುಡ್ಡು ಯಾವ ಥರ ಮೀನಿಂಗ್ಫುಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. The second-hand booksellers of Calcutta found in me their most liberal and gullible patron. And thus the rare books on Indian history, which were discarded by European clubs, barracks and private owners like Prince Ghulam Hussain, the last grandson of Tipu Sultan who died in Calcutta, were first offered to me. Our entire collection Sarkar hatra ittu. I thus laid the foundation of my historical library, but when I passed the Premchand examination and undertook original research, my library grew and branched like the proverbial banyan tree. I discarded my Calcutta book suppliers and began to give large orders year after year to the famous second-hand booksellers of England, Lusac and Trubner, Francis Edwards and Blackwell. George Sons of Bristol were my first and most copious agent in England from 1898 onwards. After 30 years, this stream stopped through the fullness of collection and also the demands of my new love: original research with the help of Persian, Marathi and English manuscripts and records. After 1897, I set myself to making truly original researches in Indo-Muslim history, and I devoted my resources mainly to acquiring Persian, Marathi and French manuscripts and printed volumes of state papers. The result is that today my collection of Persian manuscripts and Marathi printed sources is indispensable to the students of our medieval history, as it has brought together in one place all the necessary works which are scattered in many towns of India and the famous public libraries of Europe, such as the India Office, British Museum, the Bodleian Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, and the Royal Library of Berlin. And he's not done yet. He writes that Casvini's metrical history of Nadir Shah, of which there is only one copy in the whole world, and that copy was in Leningrad, Sarkar writes, I have secured photographs of this work. From the first, I equipped myself with a very necessary survey of India maps regardless of cost. I also have the oldest scientifically drawn map of British India, which is of priceless worth to me, as it gives the result of the survey before the Sepoy Mutiny and the railways changed the face of India. The historic but now discarded routes and village names are to be found in these maps only. There is no end to this quest, this search for buried truth, which we call research. Close quote. My head is still reeling. It was reeling when I read this and prepared for this, and even now it is reeling after I read this out. There's so much of material is packed in just 3 or 4 paragraphs. So survey maps. So the kind of change that he mentions a very, very important fact in this fact of history. We no longer have the knowledge of the physical geography of India, how we traveled from city to city, town to town throughout India before the railways were introduced by British. It is a huge loss actually. Anyway, so clearly there are history scholars and there are history researchers, and then there is Acharya Jadunath Sarkar, and we cannot put them all in the same bracket. Ane nadide hadi ashte. Now, building a vast personal library is one thing, but using it is entirely another thing, and this is extremely lovely. I'll just read out one eyewitness account of Jadunath Sarkar physically at work, how he looked when he was working in his personal library or study room, whatever you want to call it. And this account, it is eyewitness account. It is written by the same K.R. Kwanungo, who has become our friend now. And this is a truly extraordinary scene that comes alive. Photo tegedange ila cinema shooting mado reetil bardidare idna. And his vivid prose transports us to Jadunath Sarkar's personal library, and this is what we see. Quote, Jadunath's library was equipped like a laboratory for research in Indo-Muslim history. One could find everything near at hand. Detailed maps, gazetteers, reference books, and even a postal index, besides very useful history in print or in transcript or in manuscript. Sometimes his library wore the appearance of a place just sacked by an invisible ghost at night. Volumes taken down from shelves and scattered on the floor, maps spread out, and the table groaning under the load of books. They were lying there in that condition, sometimes for a fortnight, till he would finish his chapter and himself restore them to the right places. There were 2 things in his library that amused and puzzled us. One was an office basket, the age of which could not be determined, because time had changed its color and taken away the bottom of it, which was replaced by a thick piece of cardboard. This basket was a sort of hold-all for everything that he might need during his working hours. Rusty needles, pins, clips, bit of thread and twines, sealing wax, candles, gum bottle, seal, and sundry items. We were allowed to take things out of it, provided that they were put back afterwards. He would not allow any waste of even waste paper. Those papers with one side clean, he preserved and used for scribbling notes and first drafts. Twines of book posts and parcels went into his basket, and wrapping papers had their own place and utility. The other was a covered enamel pot which we did not have the courage to uncover. Close quote. Extraordinary gidedu. And Jadunath Sarkar's obsession for books was truly fanatical. This obsession alde innenilla. He did not think twice before spending a whole fortune on books and manuscripts, but it was difficult to persuade Jadunath Sarkar to buy a new shaving razor. Konungo gives us this story, and he says that Jadunath Sarkar used the same razor for 18 years. His homes in Calcutta, Patna, and Darjeeling, unsurprisingly, were overflowing with books. And there's a beautiful story. Once a fresh parcel of books arrived in his house in Darjeeling, and there was no place absolutely to keep it anywhere in the house. So Jadunath looked around and saw, what is the best place I can keep these new books. What he did, that he put them in the passage that connected the dining hall and the kitchen. This time, Jadunath Sarkar's wife, she saw these new set of books and she lost her temper, and I'll quote her words. It brought a thunder from her and she yelled at him, "Are your books really meant to drive out human beings from this house and throw them on the street?" Close quote. So, now, despite his obsession with books, Jadunath was not attached to them, in a kind of a very sentimental kind of attachment. And like all stalwarts, like say Acharya M. Hiriyanna, he used to take an annual inventory of the non-essential and the second-rate books, and he would, either sell them or donate them to various schools and colleges. And sometimes he bought books only to donate them. I'll give you one example. Sometime in the 1930s, he bought a full set of Portuguese histories of India. That is, the histories of India written by Portuguese travelers and other people. In 1930s, one set ಗೆ 300 ರೂಪಾಯಿ. So he bought that set and donated the entire collection to the Dhaka University Library. And I can speak from my own experience, because in the course of my researches, I have downloaded many books on history and other subjects from the famous website archive.org. The first and the second pages clearly show one seal in all these books: gift from Dr. Jadunath Sarkar. Seal ಇದೆ ಇದು. And I will round off this section with, or rather we can conclude today's session with another quote from Dr. Kwanungu. Today, Jadunath Sarkar's library, which has proved to be the nursery of research in Indo-Muslim history for 3 generations, wears a sorry spectacle in spite of its growing size. He has not allowed any servants to dust and clean his books, which he did himself occasionally, and he was helped by his pupils. He knows the exact place of every book on the shelves, and he feels annoyed when any book is misplaced. Not neglect, but sheer unwieldiness has brought his library to this sorry condition. It is nevertheless his joy and pride, no, the only consolation of his tragic life. Close quote. And tomorrow we will look at some major aspects of Jadunath Sarkar's daily routine, his disciplined habits that he had cultivated and maintained and sustained over an extraordinarily long and useful and productive and inspirational life. And it is clear that discipline was the foundation, it was the bedrock of his staggering accomplishments. Fortunately for us, we have an enormous treasure of eyewitness anecdotes and other writings from his friends and students, and obviously his closest friend G.S. Sardesai. And with that, I think we can close today's session, because if I continue, I'll have to leave it incomplete halfway. So we'll keep the best for the last, which is the concluding section of the second edition of this series titled Jadunath Sarkar, or the Ascetic Majesty of Indian History. I once again thank all of you from the bottom of my heart, and to the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to deliver this lecture series. Namaste.